You know, it seems like every time self-driving cars come up, someone always brings up the trolley problem.
Right?
Like it's the ultimate ethical dilemma.
Yeah.
And you sent us this paper that really digs into that comparison
Uh,
and whether it's as straightforward as everyone thinks.
yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
We're looking at disanalogical discourse on trolley problem for autonomous vehicles. Really gets you thinking.
So for anyone who maybe needs a refresher, what is this trolley problem everyone's so obsessed with?
Okay, so picture this. Runaway trolley heading straight for 5 people tied to the tracks.
Oh, no.
You're standing by a lever. If you pull it, the trolley switches to a different track, saving those 5 lives.
Okay.
But here's there's one person on that track.
Oh, wow. So it's like a lose-lose either way.
Exactly. That's the dilemma. Do you sacrifice one to save many?
And it's even trickier with that other version, right? The footbridge one.
Oh, yeah, the footbridge problem. That one gets intense. This time, you're on a bridge, a large person's next to you. Only way to stop the trolley is to push them off onto the tracks.
Oh, jeez. So it's still sacrificing one life for 5, but something about that feels different?
Right. Most people say pulling a lever is easier than pushing someone. But why? That's where the real ethical debate comes in.
And that's where this paper comes in too, right? Saying those thought experiments don't quite map onto self-driving cars perfectly.
Exactly. The authors are like, hold on, the trolley problem is about one person making a snap decision. Self-driving cars, way more complicated.
Because you've got the programmers who write the code, the companies making the cars, even the government setting regulations. They're all part of the decision somehow, right?
Absolutely. It's not one person's ethics. It's like trying to code a whole ethical system into the vehicle.
And it's not even a one-time decision, is it? It's constantly happening as the car drives.
Right. Like, how do you program for every single possibility? And the paper breaks this disconnect down into 3 main disanalogies, basically, where the comparison breaks down. First up, agent versus stakeholder.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that even mean when we're talking about a car swerving or something?
So, in the trolley problem, you're the agent, the one calling the shots. But with a self-driving car, it's all these stakeholders, people who've had a hand in programming it long before it even hits the road.
So it could be the engineers who built the sensors, or like you said, even the people deciding what the traffic laws should be.
Yeah, and they've all got different priorities, right? The programmer might be all about safety, but the company wants to keep costs down.
So suddenly it's not just about the ethics of should this car swerve.
Yeah.
It's whose ethics even get put into the car in the first place.
Exactly. And that's where this first disanalogy gets interesting. When those priorities clash, whose ethics win?
It's way messier than the trolley problem lets on.
Way messier and way more realistic.
Which honestly makes me think about this whole thing a bit differently. It's kind of unsettling.
It is unsettling. And it gets even more unsettling because disanalogy number 2 tackles the aftermath, the responsibility.
And that's something the trolley problem kind of glosses over, doesn't it? Like, what happens after you pull the lever?
Right. It's all theoretical. But in the real world, a self-driving car crash, that's got a real aftermath. Investigations, lawsuits, someone's got to answer for what went wrong.
And then those lines of code that determine how the car reacts, those aren't just abstract algorithms anymore, are they? They're evidence.
Exactly. So disanalogy number 2 forces us to ask, when a self-driving car causes harm, who's responsible? The programmer, the company, the person in the driver's seat.
It's like that saying, success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. Except in this case, there's a whole room of potential parents pointing fingers.
Right. And that complexity just isn't there in the trolley problem.
It lets us off easy with a neat little ethical puzzle, but the reality is so much messier.
It really highlights just how different these scenarios are, even though on the surface they might seem similar.
Which, I'm not going to lie, makes me even more unsettled than before.
Oh, and if you're unsettled now, just wait, because disanalogy number 3 throws another wrench in the whole thing. Remember how the trolley problem relies on certainty? 5 people will die or 1 person will die. It's all very clear-cut,
Yeah.
real life, never that black and white, especially with something as unpredictable as driving.
Exactly.
And that's where the trolley problem really starts to crumble, because in the real world, so many factors can change the outcome of a crash. The speed of the car, the road conditions, even something as random as a pedestrian's reaction time.
So unlike the trolley problem with its nice, neat little equation, a self-driving car has to constantly reevaluate risk in a dynamic environment. It's making judgment calls with incomplete information.
Think about it. A kid runs into the street, chasing a ball. Does the car swerve, potentially putting its own passengers at risk? Or does it slam on the brakes, knowing that could cause a chain reaction behind it? Tough calls even for human drivers.
And we expect a self-driving car to make those split-second decisions, but with the added pressure of having those choices pre-programmed by someone else entirely.
It's a lot to ask. And it shows how the trolley problem, while it's a good starting point, doesn't capture just how complex self-driving cars are in the real world.
It kind of makes that title, Disanalogical Discourse, even more appropriate because it's not saying the trolley problem is useless. It's just there's so much more nuance to think about.
Absolutely. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this paper. Because after pointing out all the ways the trolley problem falls short, it actually proposes a totally different way of thinking about the ethics of self-driving cars.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What's the alternative?
Instead of trying to pre-program a response for every possible scenario, what if we based it on care?
Care. Now that's an interesting concept. But if I'm being honest, I'm having a little trouble picturing how you translate care into lines of code.
That's a good question. And honestly, there are no easy answers. But at its core, care ethics emphasizes relationships, empathy, understanding the specific situation instead of just applying rigid rules.
So less about giving the car a checklist of rights and wrongs, and more about, I don't know, giving it some kind of moral intuition.
Yeah. Like right now, we approach self-driving car ethics from this very utilitarian standpoint. Minimize harm, reduce casualties.
Right, like a cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly. But care ethics asks us to think beyond that. What if, instead of defaulting to minimize casualties, the car could also consider things like how vulnerable the people involved are?
So it wouldn't just be calculating the number of lives, but also who those lives are.
Exactly. Is it a group of adults crossing the street or a child who darted out unexpectedly? A human driver would instinctively react differently, you know? We inherently understand that not all one life versus five life situations are the same. And a human driver brings all their experiences, their understanding of social cues, their capacity for empathy to those judgments. Care ethics argues that for a self-driving car to be truly ethical, it might need a similar capacity to assess those nuances, even if it's on a computational level.
Which brings up a whole other question. Is that even possible? Can you program a machine to make those kinds of nuanced, empathy-driven decisions?
And that is the million-dollar question. And it's one that philosophers and computer scientists are still trying to figure out. But that's what I think is so compelling about this paper. It pushes us beyond these thought experiments and makes us confront these really complex questions.
It's like that classic sci-fi trope. We're so busy asking if we can build intelligent machines that we forget to ask if we should.
Right. It's definitely a slippery slope. But this paper doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It just sheds light on a new way of thinking about the problem. And for someone like you who really wants to understand these issues, that's where the real value is.
It's giving me a lot to think about, that's for sure.
And that's what these deep dives are all about, giving you the information, the different perspectives, so you can form your own conclusions.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on care ethics for self-driving cars? Could it even work? Tell us what you think on our socials, and until next time, we'll catch you on the next deep dive. And that's something the trolley problem kind of glosses over, doesn't it? Like what happens after you pull the lever?
Yeah, it is. It's all very theoretical.
Right.
But when a self-driving car crashes in the real world, there are consequences. Investigations, lawsuits. Someone has to answer for what happened.
Exactly. And all that code that determines how the car reacts.
Yeah.
That's not just some abstract algorithm anymore. That's evidence.
Exactly. So this disanalogy, this difference in responsibility, it forces us to think about, when a self-driving car actually causes harm, who's on the hook? The programmer, the manufacturer, the person who is supposed to be driving.
It's almost like that saying, success has 1,000 fathers, failure is an orphan.
Right.
Except here, there's a whole crowd of potential parents, and none of them want to claim responsibility.
Exactly. And that kind of complexity, that's just totally absent from the trolley problem.
It's like it lets us off the hook with this neat little ethical puzzle,
right,
when the reality is so much messier.
Way messier. And that takes us to disanalogy number 3, which throws another wrench in the works. So the trolley problem, it loves certainty, right? 5 people will die. Or 1 person will die. Very cut and dry.
Yeah.
But life's not like that.
Not even close.
Especially not something as unpredictable as, driving.
Right. There's so many things you can't predict when you're on the road.
Exactly. And that's where the trolley problem analogy really falls apart, because so many things can affect the outcome of a crash, The speed of the car, the road conditions, even something as small as how quickly a pedestrian reacts.
So it's not like that trolley problem equation at all.
Nope.
A self-driving car is out there making these judgment calls with incomplete information in a constantly changing environment.
Exactly. Think about it. A kid runs into the road chasing a ball.
Oh, geez.
Does the car swerve? Maybe put its own passengers at risk? Or slam on the brakes and risk a pileup behind it? Those are tough calls even for us humans.
Right, and those are the decisions we're expecting these self-driving cars to make.
In a split second.
With all the added pressure of knowing those choices were pre-programmed by someone else.
It's a tall order. And I think it just highlights how, even though the trolley problem is a useful starting point, it doesn't come close to capturing the complexity of self-driving cars out there in the real world.
It really drives home that idea of disanalogical discourse, because it's not saying the trolley problem is totally useless, but that there's just like layers and layers of nuance that we haven't even begun to unpack.
Yeah. Exactly. And what I find so fascinating is that this paper, after it goes through all the ways the trolley problem misses the mark, it actually offers up a whole new way to think about the ethics of these cars.
Okay, now you've really got me curious. What's the alternative?
What if instead of programming a specific response for every scenario,
Yeah.
what if it was all based on care?
Care. That's a really interesting way to think about it. But I got to be honest, I'm still kind of stuck on how do you code care? Like, how's a machine supposed to understand that?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It does seem kind of far out at first, but think of it this way. Right now, the way we approach self-driving cars, it's very, like, utilitarian. Yeah.
Right, like just the cold, hard numbers.
Exactly. Minimize the harm, reduce casualties, all that. But care ethics, it challenges us to think beyond that. Like, what if, instead of defaulting to minimize casualties, the car could consider, like, how vulnerable the people in danger actually are?
So not just how many lives, but who those lives belong to.
Exactly. Is it a group of adults or a little kid who ran out into the street without looking? I mean, a human driver, they'd reacted differently.
Or for sure,
Yeah.
you'd cut someone way more slack if they swerved to avoid a kid, even if it meant putting themselves in danger, versus like if they did that for a squirrel or something.
See, we get it. Not every one life versus five lives situation is the same. And human drivers bring all their experiences to the table, right? They understand social cues, they have empathy. Care ethics argues that for a self-driving car to be truly ethical, it might need that same capacity to like grasp the subtleties of the situation, even if it's happening on a computer level.
Which I guess leads to a whole other question. Is that even possible? Can you program a machine to have those nuanced, empathy-driven reactions?
That is the question. And
Yeah.
honestly, it's one that's got philosophers and computer scientists scratching their heads even now. But I think that's what makes this paper so cool. It moves us past these simple thought experiments and makes us really grapple with these huge, messy questions.
It's like that whole thing in sci-fi movies. We're so worried about whether we can build thinking machines, we forget to ask if we should.
It's a slippery slope, for sure. But this paper isn't trying to give you all the answers. It's just showing you there's a whole different way of thinking about this problem. And for someone like you, clearly interested in going deep on this stuff, that's got to get those gears turning.
It definitely has. This whole conversation's been super thought-provoking.
And that's what these deep dives are for, giving you the information, all the angles, so you can make up your own mind.
Couldn't have put it better myself. And listeners, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this whole care ethics thing for self-driving cars? Is it even possible? Hit us up on our socials and let us know. And until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.